All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second webinar Behind the Work, uncovering the true scope of licensure compliance challenges in higher education. I'm Jonathan McNicholes. I'm the manager of policy and stakeholder engagement here at the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, helping us navigate all the complex policy things that our states navigate. A few housekeeping things for us as we enter this webinar. For you all to know, we are recording this conversation and that we will post the recordings to our website after the presentation if you missed something or want to share it with others. We welcome all questions, but ask that you use the Q&A box and that we will address all the questions at the end live. Any ones we do not cover, we can cover afterwards in a follow-up. Mary posted a link to the presentation in the chat that you have access to. And then afterwards, upon closing out today's meeting, you'll have an opportunity to take a brief survey. If you could please complete this to help us improve all of our future convenings, it's always greatly appreciated. It helps us ensure we're providing the best services that we can. I am joined today by a fantastic panel of individuals. We got Sarah Cheverton. Sarah serves as the State Authorization and Compliance Officer for Online and Distance Education Learning at James Madison University. Sarah brings a depth of expertise in state authorization, regulatory compliance, and the evolving landscape of online education. With over 27 years of experience at James Madison, she brings a pool of historic knowledge and recent knowledge and insight into inner workings of institutions in navigating complex compliance requirements while expanding access and quality in distance learning. We have also joined with us Kathryn Kerensky. She serves as the Director of Digital Learning Policy and Compliance for the State Authorization Network, with a focus on institutional and programmatic compliance rules and regulations, including accreditation requirements, international compliance issues, and strategies for institutional regulatory compliance when serving students by means of distance digital learning. With her doctorate or Juris Doctorate from the University of Louisville, Kathryn brings more than a decade of experience of federal regulatory compliance and distance education. And finally, once again, we have Kris Maul with over a decade of experience working in professional licensure regulatory compliance. He has supported institutions in all 50 states and U.S. territories. Kris received his Juris Doctor from Hamline University with expertise in researching, analyzing, and interpreting professional licensure laws, regulation, rules, and policies, and creating comprehensive student resources to navigating all stages of professional licensure. He brings a wealth of experience to the professional licensure community. And with that, I will turn it away to this fantastic panel for this great conversation.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to be here just to share information and with such a great colleagues to share it with. To begin, I just wanted to provide a quick overview of kind of where we're heading today. We'll start by discussing the impact, so kind of why professional licensure compliance matters so significantly for institutions. From there, we'll move into the responsibilities, looking at the complex landscape that institutions are navigating. We'll then spend time on the research, where we'll share findings from a survey that SAN did and the data to highlight some of the trends and challenges and approaches that institutions reported when it comes to licensure compliance. After that, we'll explore insights from licensing boards. One of the goals of the work was not only to understand institutional practice, but also understanding how licensing boards themselves view some of these issues. And then we'll transition from findings to action, focusing on what institutions can take away from the research and how the findings may help inform institutional work. We'll then discuss implementation and process considerations, including some suggestions to build sustainable compliance practice. And finally, we'll leave time at the end for questions and discussion. Before we begin, I also just want to note that the information that we share today is intended for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. We strongly recommend institutions work closely with their legal counsel when evaluating risk, developing policies, and communicating professional licensure information to students and prospective students. So to understand the current environment, we want to first briefly ground this discussion in what changed for institutions and how the regulatory landscape evolved. We'll also preview some very high-level survey findings on the institutional impact before transitioning into a deeper discussion of institutional responsibilities. One of the most important shifts in recent years is that professional licensure compliance can now directly impact whether an institution is able to enroll a student in a program. In some cases, if an institution cannot determine that a program meets the educational requirements for licensure in a state where the student is located, they may need to restrict enrollment in that program for that student. To understand the significance of this, it helps to understand how the federal framework evolved. Under an earlier disclosure-focused framework, institutions were required to provide disclosures about whether programs met educational requirements in the student's state or not. But importantly, disclosures themselves generally did not prevent enrollment. Students received information and could still decide whether or not to proceed. The certification procedures regulations fundamentally changed that structure. So, in addition to disclosures, institutions are now expected to make affirmative state by state determinations before enrollment can occur. And if an institution cannot determine whether the program meets educational requirements, institutions generally cannot enroll the student. This is a significant change in institutional responsibility and risk. As we'll get into more detail, the work involved to continue enrolling students where possible creates much more work than many people might initially assume when you hear the phrase certification procedures. So, with such a significant change in institutional responsibility, especially as it impacts enrollment, it probably isn't super surprising to see that institutions in our survey reported substantial increases in workload related to professional licensure compliance. 86% of institutions reported either a moderate or significant increase in workload. Nearly half, about 48%, described the increase as significant. And importantly, these impacts were reported across institutions of all sizes and sectors. What's also important is that many institutions reported these workload increases without corresponding increases in staffing or resources. And because this work can compound across multiple programs, professions, and jurisdictions, even what might sound like a small increase on paper can feel significant very quickly. One thing the qualitative responses helped in the survey to illustrate is that the numbers alone do not fully capture the experience institutions describe. Most institutions, approximately 72%, reported adding between 1 and 10 hours of licensure compliance work per week, with 4 to 6 hours being the most frequently cited range. The quote here that I'll read really resonated strongly because it highlights how workload increases are highly contextual. In the first part of the quote, it reads, this is from the survey response. It's been an undue burden. 4 to 6 hours doesn't sound like a lot, but 50 states plus territories and multiple programs, it's a lot for one person. All these requirements are burdensome. No public institution wants to harm students. There has to be a better way. For some institutions, an additional 3 hours per week represented a major operational strain. For others, even substantially larger increases in hours were described as moderate. This variation really underscores the kind of theme behind this quote and how deeply context and resources can shape institutional experience. But I think the quote also highlights something important, especially there at the end, where institutions are trying really hard to protect students and also to preserve access where possible and to comply responsibly within a highly complex framework. So we have our first poll that we're going to launch. Before Kris gets into more detail on the institutional responsibilities in professional licensure compliance, we just wanted to do a poll to get more of a sense of your perceptions and have a bit of a temperature check on the impact on your institution. So if you would complete the poll, we ask, how would you describe the workload for professional licensure compliance at your institution? Significant, where there's the workload's high, there's ongoing demand. Moderate, where you have regular workload, but it's manageable. Little workload, where it's minimal, maybe just occasional tasks, or that it's not currently applicable. Maybe you don't have any professional licensure responsibilities in your role. So we'll leave this open for just a minute or so to get a sense of how people are feeling. All right. Let's see. So I see 38% chose significant, that the workload feels significant at the institution. So that's a lot of ongoing demand and dedicated time and resources. 45% said moderate, that's regular and manageable. 8% said there was little workload, and for 9%, not currently applicable. So that those people might not have professional lives or responsibilities. But we want to thank you all for sharing these insights. We think it's very helpful, and we hope that you're able to learn a lot as we go forward. And Kris will share more information on the responsibilities.
Great, thanks, Kathryn. So as Kathryn mentioned, we're going to dig in now to some of the specifics around responsibilities that colleges and universities have when it comes to professional licensure related programs. And it is complex. So I'm going to provide a high level overview here. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty weeds in each of these areas. If any of you have questions on anything, feel free to put that in the Q&A and we'll try to address those at the end. Let's start off with the three kind of buckets, how we like to organize it at HELP when we're talking about these responsibilities. So these are all connected back to federal Title IV regulations, as well as SARA Policy 5.2. And the three responsibilities are institutions need to understand if your professional licensure programs meet or do not meet the educational requirements for licensure in your state where your institution is located, as well as other states where you're enrolling students or recruiting or advertising for those programs. The second one is around certifying, and Kathryn already mentioned this responsibility. It's that PPA certification, the Program Participation Agreement certification responsibility. I'll get into some more details here in a moment, but this is the most impactful change that went into effect a couple of years ago now and has driven a lot of the additional strains and challenges as related to the workload for professional licensure. And the third responsibility is around communicating. So this is about those disclosures, the public disclosures and individual direct disclosures that have been around for a while. And again, I'll get into some more details here in the next few slides. So a little deeper into understanding, as I mentioned, institutions must understand if your licensure programs meet those educational requirements in each US state or US territory where you are recruiting students or advertising the program, and most importantly, where you are enrolling students from. And this applies really for every type of licensure program. And in order to understand if your programs meet or don't meet, it requires a tremendous amount of research and work. So you need to know which states are offering specific license types related to your programs. If you're enrolling students from that location, you need to understand what those specific educational requirements are. Typically, that research is done in the state law. So you are looking at state statutes, regulations, rules, information available on licensing board websites, application materials, other third-party sources, kind of scouring all that to come to an understanding of what's really going on for that state. And then importantly, also need to compare your specific program. So this is up to each individual institution to be making these determinations on if your program meets or doesn't meet. We'll get into some more of the why is that such a challenge here in a few moments, but that is the basics here. You do have to have this understanding of what other states require for licensure and if your specific curriculum and your programs meet that or do not. So that certify responsibility, oh, sorry, one more on understanding here. Some of the challenges. So I didn't mention it, but this is something governed by states. So we're looking at a state by state proposition here. Every state can decide which license types or which professions or occupations they want to license, how they're going to do that, and they get to set their own standards or requirements. So we do see inconsistency across states. There are very few examples of a license type that has complete uniformity across all of the US. In addition, licensing boards just practically operate a little bit differently. So there are some rare instances where they will review or evaluate an out-of-state program and offer you some information on how it meets or doesn't meet, but that's pretty rare. Typically, they're just going to provide you with information or point you back to their law. So, right, point you back to the regulations and say, this is what a licensed applicant needs to demonstrate in order to qualify, in order to meet those educational requirements. So it really, again, is on the shoulders of institutions to be engaging in this research work and then doing that curriculum comparison or that program comparison to try to come to a decision on if it meets or doesn't meet. There's not very many instances where an out-of-state institution can get some sort of formal authorization or approval by a licensing board that's going to indicate that your program meets or doesn't meet. I think I'll go on from there, Kathryn. So we'll shift to the certify responsibility next. And again, this is under the program participation agreement, which is essentially the master contract that your institution is signing with the U.S. Department of Education in order to participate in the federal Title IV program. So this was added in July of 2024. It requires now that institutions certify that your licensure programs meet educational requirements where your institution is located and where your distance education students are located at the time of enrollment in that licensure program. Distance education, I have in italicized font here on the slide because there's a unique definition that the Department of Education is using here in this instance. It's really any student who could take one or more course via distance during that first term of enrollment in the licensure program. So it is much more broad than what many of us would consider a distance education program to be. It could obviously include any on-campus program if there is an online section option or an online course option for those students that would otherwise be attending in person. So. And I think I covered the rest of that already. So again, it's some very important responsibility. And as Kathryn mentioned, it could limit your ability to enroll students. So you have to certify that it meets where that student is located. Otherwise, they're not able to enroll in your licensure program unless you secure a written attestation exception, which we'll get into later. And again, if people have questions, feel free to put that in the Q&A. Okay, so we'll move on then to this third responsibility, communicate. As I mentioned before, it covers both public disclosures, which are usually on an institution's website, as well as the individual direct disclosures that have to be sent to those individual prospective students or students. Public disclosures now, institutions should be indicating whether your program meets or does not meet the educational requirements for each state or territory where you are enrolling students from or recruiting or advertising. I will note that there's that third kind of option we've not determined. This was used quite liberally prior to 2024 by many institutions, but I think with the change in regulations in 2024, this should be used in more limited contexts. So if you're truly never going to be enrolling students from a particular territory, let's say, the Federated States of Micronesia, it might make sense to still have that as a not determined status. If you're not enrolling students, you're not recruiting or advertising. But otherwise, if you could be enrolling students, or definitely if you are enrolling students, you need to have made that determination that it meets the educational requirements. Okay, and then with individual direct disclosures, this is kind of a dual responsibility here. You have those for prospective students, so those who have not officially been enrolled in the program yet need to receive this direct disclosure if they're located somewhere where the program does not meet the educational requirements, or again, in those limited instances where you've not determined, you need to send an individual direct disclosure prior to enrollment. Just as a note, this is the same population that would need to go through that written attestation exception process in order for you to actually enroll them. And that's, again, related back to the certify responsibility under the PPA certification. So if they're located somewhere where it doesn't meet or it's undetermined, you have to provide a disclosure and they need to provide to you a written attestation. For your current students, if something changes with the situation and now they're located and it does not meet, you need to send them a direct disclosure within 14 calendar days to let them know they're now located and it does not meet state or territory. And so, of course, this could happen for a number of reasons. That student could change their location and let the institution know. That could trigger it. Or something could change with the state's requirements for licensure. and now the curriculum no longer satisfies it. You could also change your program's curriculum. That could trigger this need if it turns into a scenario where the curriculum and the program no longer meet those educational requirements. All right, so we can move on to the next slide here, Kathryn. Thank you. So just to point out, those three responsibilities that I just went over again at a pretty high level are specific to the federal Title IV regulations and SARA Policy 5.2, which relates back to those federal Title IV regulations. But in addition to that, there are many other responsibilities or obligations that institutions have when it comes to your licensure program. So obviously, first and foremost is your ability to be offering programs in other states. So this would be state authorization or your SARA related obligations to hold that approval and continued approval. We also have licensing board approvals. So for specific types of professions and occupations, and I'll say the biggest example of this is in nursing. If you have nursing students located in other states, there often is some sort of review, approval, or authorization that state nursing board is going to require of your programs or of the clinical sites where those students are going to be completing those clinical experiences or something else. We also have, particular faculty licensing requirements that come into play. Again, in the nursing world, it's pretty prominent, but we do see some examples from other professions as well. So that's a whole nother layer in addition to those three responsibilities we just went over. And then there's obviously misrepresentation and consumer protection laws and regulations that everyone needs to be aware of. And then other very important federal requirements as well. So I know many of you are enmeshed in some of the changes with Workforce Pell, other things that have been happening. We also have some licensure specific things from Veterans Affairs as well as Prison Pell that can be very impactful too. So all this just to say is it is a massive layer here where you just keep unpeeling that onion and you get to some more obligations, and all of this adds to the stress and pressure on the workloads at the institution. Which is why it often feels like this increasing workload. So many institutions are trying to manage all of those regulatory requirements to avoid restricting enrollments, right? So as Kathryn mentioned and I said, it really is now down to your ability to enroll students from certain states. And so if you're trying to keep access open, keep your program able to enroll across the country or across multiple states, this work needs to be done. So you simply have to figure out a way to absorb this workload if you want to do it. And it is a lot of detailed state by state analysis, as I mentioned. So it's looking at each state's law and requirements for what it takes to earn a professional license, and then comparing your specific licensure programs to come to that determination if it meets or doesn't meet the educational requirements. Often with licensing boards, there can be, as I said, not really a mechanism for approvals, but there is a need to interact with them. So whether you're trying to get a nursing board to authorize your clinical sites in the state, or you're trying to get some sort of answer to better understand what their educational requirements are, it requires a lot of back and forth with licensing boards who are often understaffed themselves and don't really have a lot of capacity to be engaging with out-of-state programs or institutions. So I think with that, I will pass it over to...
Thank you.
Yep, go ahead, Kathryn. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Kris. So we have our second poll that we are going to launch. So having gone through an overview of what professional licensure compliance entails, we wanted to know for you, where has most of the work in professional licensure compliance come from? You should be able to select all that apply. There's options for state research and determination of requirements, the disclosures, internal coordination and training, so working with your academic units, advising faculty, other institutional stakeholders, ongoing monitoring, so like tracking all these changes, and or other. And if you're, able and willing, sharing what those others might be in the chat. We'd love to hear, more institutional experiences. So we'll leave this up for a minute or so. All right. Thank you all for participating in the poll. I see that 79% chose state research and determination of requirements, 37% chose disclosures, 54% chose internal coordination and training, 59% chose ongoing monitoring, and 2% chose other. So again, thank you for sharing. If you're willing to share in the chat, look forward to reading what you have to say there. One of the things I think this highlights is that while institutions, may experience the workload differently, professional licensure compliance has institution-wide implications for workload distribution. And we'll have more about what institutions reported in our next section. So now we'll shift from discussing the responsibilities to looking more at what institutions reported through the research and what trends emerged from the survey findings. So a little bit about the survey. In the spring of 2025, Sarah and I conducted a survey of private, public, 4-year, 2-year, small, large, and other types of higher ed institutions across the country. The purpose of the survey was to develop a deeper understanding of the work involved in compliance with licensure compliance regulations, especially since enactment of the July 2024 certification procedures regulations. We sent the invitation out through SAN and other communication avenues and received 228 responses, representing about the same number of institutions. And if you were one of those who submitted that, we thank you very much. We also conducted 16 in-depth interviews with representatives of various types of institutions to gain more nuanced understanding of their responses. To help us understand how all this is playing out, the goal of the survey was really to answer 3 questions. So where is the workload showing up in institutions? How are institutions actually managing these responsibilities day to day? And what kind of decisions or institutional impacts are emerging as a result? Ultimately, it was designed to better understand how compliance work is shaping real institutional operations, things like staffing, workflows, program decisions, and in some cases, potentially student access. First, before we look at workload and management and impact, we can look at what type of institutions responded to the survey. As you will be able to see here, various types of institutions responded, with 2- and 4-year public institutions making up the largest group. 32% of respondents were private nonprofit and 3.1% were private for-profits. 4% fell into a unique group including system offices, career or professional schools, etc. And you might be wondering how well your type of institution is represented in the survey. So Sarah and I considered this and analyzed the data from multiple perspectives, and even if the numbers of a particular group were small. And what we found was that while the type of institution had some impact on the responses, we concluded that other attributes of the institution, so the institutional size and number of licensure programs, seem to have a greater impact. So we hope that you'll find the results to represent at least some of your institution's characteristics. Now let's look at how the regulations affected workload. First, in regard to workload increases, we found that almost all types of institutions experienced an increase, although to varying degrees. For example, except for institutions with between 1,000 and 3,000 students, a slight majority of all sized institutions reported a significant increase in workload compared to a moderate or minimal change. Private for-profits were most likely to describe a significant increase, although this might have been different if we had more respondents in that category. And 2-year publics were the most likely to report moderate increases. Now, you might be thinking, what's considered significant or moderate? We thought of that too, so we asked respondents to estimate the number of additional work hours they experienced. And like I mentioned earlier, we found that what feels significant to one may not to another. So, for example, a few hours of additional work per week might feel minor to someone who's already devoting many hours to compliance, whereas someone who typically spends maybe just an hour a week on licensure tasks may consider a similar increase substantial or significant. For example, based on the data, we saw some institutions who reported a significant impact, but estimated an average of fewer than 3 hours of additional work per week. But there were others who considered 21 or more hours per week a moderate increase in workload. So, what might account for those differences? The data suggests that to some extent the type and size of institution and the number of licensure programs influence the perception of workload. So, for example, 2-year public's perceptions generally aligned with hours, meaning the more hours added, the more likely to perceive the work as significant. Larger institutions' perceptions of workload also tended to align with the number of additional hours worked, while some smaller institutions were somewhat more likely to consider increases of 4 to 6 as significant. Based on this data, we suspect that how the additional workload feels comes down to the institution's capacity to absorb the extra workload, whatever amount that happens to be. And as we'll see later, that capacity can vary across institutions. As we stated earlier, and as we illustrated in our poll, several areas of work contributed to the increased workload. The most significant workload increases occurred in 5 key areas. First was state research, which was cited by 90% of survey respondents. That represents a very time-intensive responsibility, where compliance professionals must interpret and track requirements across more than 50 jurisdictions, each with unique statutes and expectations. Second, student disclosures and communications. That was identified by 85% of respondents, and that requires institutions to translate complex regulatory language into clear, accurate, and timely information for prospective and enrolled students, as Kris described. Third, internal coordination and training, which was reported by 79% of institutions, highlights the cross-functional nature of this work. Effective compliance requires collaboration among academic programs, legal counsel, admissions, registrars, and a variety of institutional stakeholders and offices. Fourth is ongoing monitoring of state and federal requirements, cited by 63% of respondents, and that reflects the dynamic nature of the regulatory environment. Because requirements evolve, policies change, and institutions must be continually assessing and reassessing their responsibilities in order to remain compliant. Finally, data reporting and documentation was noted by 51% of institutions, and that just underscores the importance of maintaining defensible records, where institutions must document their research, decisions, and communications in order to demonstrate compliance and mitigate legal and financial risk. To get a better understanding of why we see increases in time on these tasks, Sarah's going to look more at internal coordination and training and how that works in the context of student disclosures and communication.
Thanks, Kathryn. So at a high level, the federal regulations require institutions, as Kris explained, to publicly disclose where programs do or do not meet the educational requirements for licensure. And in certain situations, we have to directly notify the students when a program does not meet requirements in their state. A direct notification, as many of you probably know, is customized to the individual. So having access to data is critical and can be very time-consuming. We found that 93% of the respondents reported having a public disclosure process. However, only 77% reported having a direct disclosure process. And 15% of the respondents were not sure if they had a direct disclosure process at all. So what might explain these results? Why, for example, would only 77% of the institutions have a direct disclosure process and 15% be unsure if they do? Well, there can be a lot of reasons for that, but one thing our research highlighted is that direct disclosures are far more operationally complex than many people realize. Institutions first have to determine where the programs meet requirements. Then they have to identify where the students are physically located, not just once, but at key points across their academic career. Connect that information to the correct licensure determination, trigger the appropriate communication process and response, document those actions, and then continuously monitor for changes in both student location and state requirements. As we can see here, a direct disclosure process includes multiple information systems and almost always crosses multiple functions or departments within or even outside of the institution. So it's clear why this process requires a lot more than just a disclosure web page or just an email, a boilerplate email. Next slide. The research also verified that state requirement research contributes to the additional workload. In fact, it is one of the most time-consuming tasks, as we've said multiple times. It's also one of the most important, especially now that student enrollment hinges on whether our programs meet the requirements. With these stakes so high, confirmation from a licensing board would be the most authoritative method for ensuring alignment with state requirements. Remember, we're using the word certification. However, in practice, institutions frequently describe challenges in obtaining that confirmation. Licensing boards can be difficult to reach, slow to respond, unable to provide definitive guidance due to statutory limitations or resource constraints. And Kris had also mentioned that before. In some cases, institutions report receiving only general references back to published rules rather than program-specific determinations. And I can say from being an institution that that can be frustrating. Thus, only about 6% of the institutions report relying on direct confirmation from state licensing boards as their primary method for determining whether their programs must meet licensure requirements. That leaves a very large majority, 82%, that rely primarily on their own interpretation or a mix of interpretation and some type of external reference, such as informal communication with board staff or some kind of third-party compliance tool. The implication of the variability in both state requirements and of process is not just operational. As we've said, it can impact the students. When different institutions interpret the same state requirements in different ways, it can lead to inconsistencies in program eligibility determinations. For students and graduates, this can create confusion about why program availability differs across states or even among institutions within the same state. Ultimately, I think what this does is highlight that while direct confirmation from licensing boards may be the ideal, the current structure of information flow means that most institutions are instead relying on internal interpretation that is not and often cannot be fully validated by external resources. And I want to add here that most of us do not have our JD. Most of us are not attorneys and lawyers and used to reading and interpreting this language. Next slide. Interestingly, the federal framework assumes a consistency in clarity and accessibility across these state licensure systems. That often, as we know, does not exist. State licensing boards differ in their authority, in their processes, in their staffing, their responsiveness, their terminology, and their willingness or ability to provide program-specific guidance. Some states have formal approval processes for programs operating in the state, others do not. And many licensure requirements require substantial interpretation rather than straightforward checklist comparisons. As a result, institutions are frequently conducting independent analysis without being able to fully validate those determinations externally. This creates that operational burden. It also creates significant institutional risk. Next slide. So another approach to managing state requirements is to simply avoid that risk altogether. 32% of the respondents indicated that their institutions are simply avoiding the risks by restricting enrollment in certain states. They might make that decision because they don't feel comfortable enrolling someone from a state that hasn't confirmed from the licensing board that the program meets requirements. You might remember that only 6% of the institutions rely on direct confirmation from the licensing boards. Why? Well, again, as we see here, 56% of our respondents indicated that it's difficult to obtain the data. Secondly, as we mentioned previously, requirements vary from state to state and are often difficult to interpret. And third, there's a cost to meeting those requirements, especially if the institution decides to revise its curriculum to meet those requirements, or if there are fees associated with meeting requirements. And finally, of course, in some cases, an institution would simply be in violation of certain state limitations, such as a restriction on online or hybrid programming. So now our third and final poll. In this survey, we're interested to know, before we share what we found in the survey, what professions or programs where you had to restrict enrollment due to licensure requirements? Give another few seconds here. This might be a little more difficult because you might not know, for example. Okay, thank you all for doing that. So as we can see, it looks like nursing and teacher ed are a little head-to-head here. So nursing showed that 42% of you selected nursing as a program where you had to restrict enrollment. Teacher ed or ed preparation or preparatory programs, 44%. 34% of you selected mental health professions where you had to restrict enrollment. And just a small number of you, 4%, selected service and personal care professions. And then another small number, 6%, selected skilled trades and technical programs. And I believe that we have one person does have other and perhaps put something in the chat. And then 32% of you indicated that you have not had to restrict enrollment in any programs for these reasons. Perhaps you either are not offering them in states where there's some kind of conflict, or you just haven't at all, or your programs meet all the requirements from every state and territory in the country, and that would be cool. Thank you, Mary, appreciate that. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about this restricting enrollment. First, those limits are occurring in specific disciplines, and we'll see how you compared to us. Most commonly, they were in nursing, teacher ed, and mental health programs. Second, some states present more challenges than others. Institutions reported restricting or considering restricting enrollment in certain states, often citing a combination of regulatory complexity or cost, limited internal capacity to manage multi-state compliance. Frequently mentioned states were California, New York, Texas, Washington, Colorado, Georgia, and Tennessee, and you may have experienced others as well. These findings make an important point that enrollment restrictions are not confined to one region or to one profession. We were also interested to know if any particular institutional characteristics influence decisions to restrict enrollment. Our data suggests that institutional size, the number of licensure programs, and the degree of workload increase have the greatest influence. Some specifics. First, the largest share of institutions reported enrollment restrictions were four-year public and private nonprofit institutions. Second, institutions under a 3,000 student FTE were less likely to restrict enrollment, while institutions with 20,000 or more student FTE were the most likely. Third, institutions implementing restrictions tend to manage a large portfolio of licensure programs. 57% reported overseeing 11 or more licensure programs, with 13% offering more than 50. That said, we did discover a small subset of smaller institutions that restricted enrollment despite offering only a handful of licensure programs. And finally, as we've seen, the data show that nearly all institutions restricting enrollment reported increased workload since the certification procedures took effect. Just over 1/4 of those respondents reported increases of 16 or more hours per week. Another 52% indicated moderate increases of 4 to 10 hours weekly. These findings again illustrate the depth of the compliance challenge that led many institutions to adopt restrictive enrollment strategies. Next slide, thank you. So far, we've seen that variations in institutional size, number of licensure programs, and type of institution might explain some of the variation in how institutions are responding to the uncertainty around state licensure requirements. But our research also found that variation across institutions in staffing capacity and availability of infrastructure, of systems and tools, and other internal resources might contribute to variations in institutional response as well. For example, on the staffing side, most institutions are operating with very limited dedicated capacity. Despite the complexity of the work, only about 22% of the institutions reported hiring additional staff, while another 23% were considering it. That means more than half, 55% made no staffing changes at all in response to the new regulations. In practice, we found that licensure compliance is often being managed by a single individual or distributed informally across multiple offices, such as compliance, academic affairs, registrar, admissions, and so on. This scenario creates a vulnerability. Staff turnover, even in a single role, can significantly disrupt institutional knowledge. It can increase the compliance risk and influence responses to the variation and uncertainty around state requirements. Next slide. So we know people are a critical part of the work, but the technology infrastructure that I just referred to in the previous slide is just as important. So we were interested to know if and how institutions were using technology solutions to automate some of the tasks, like licensure tracking, direct disclosure processes, or monitoring alignment between state requirements and program curriculum. We found that much of this work is still being done manually. Spreadsheet-driven tracking systems, email-based coordination, and repeated data entry across platforms. In fact, only 6% reported having a fully automated process. In contrast, 50% of the respondent group reported still using a fully or mostly manual direct disclosure process. For some institutions, the scarcity of appropriate resources limits their ability to automate direct disclosures or other compliance tasks. Other institutions might determine that little benefit can be gained, and that's a perspective that we would like to explore further. Regardless, those who implemented any level of automation cautioned that even when the direct disclosure process is quote unquote fully automated, manual reviews of data, disclosures, attestations, and other output are sometimes required, especially when you have unique circumstances. All automated systems require some degree of human intervention and oversight. Efforts to estimate human resource needs should always consider this reality of automation, regardless of its breadth and level of sophistication. And finally, in addition to enrollment restrictions, staffing, and automation, we found that some institutions use the student attestation, which was referred to earlier, to address that complexity in certifying the programs and that they meet state licensure requirements. In fact, what we found is it is the most commonly used tool. 43% of the responding institutions reported using the self-attestation. Okay, so just as a reminder, what is that? If a prospective student is located in a state where the program does not meet the requirements, the institution can allow a prospective student to submit a self-attestation indicating in which state or territory they plan to pursue licensure and employment upon graduation. If that jurisdiction recognizes the program as meeting the requirements, the institution can enroll the student. As I just stated, 43% of the group indicated they allow prospective students to submit one. On the other end of the spectrum, in terms of time involved, only 7% indicated that their institution adjusts curriculum to match the requirements, a much more challenging task. As you can see illustrated in the chart, institutions used a variety of tools and methods to address state requirements. And I'll point out here that although fewer than 50% of the group used any one of these practices, one respondent commented that they, quote, should have been doing many of these things listed above, but with very limited capacity, it's very difficult. So Kathryn will now share insights from another entity in the professional licensure compliance process, and that's the licensing boards. Kathryn?
Thank you, Sarah. So up to this point, we've focused primarily on the institutional experience, so how institutions are interpreting, operationalizing, and managing professional licensure compliance requirements in practice. But one of the things that kept emerging, and as we know, is that institutions are not operating in isolation. This work depends heavily on interaction with state licensing boards and regulatory agencies. So to better understand their perspective, we gathered insights from licensing board representatives themselves through a live polling activity conducted during an in-person CLEAR conference session. One of the clearest themes that emerged from that licensing board discussion was that many agencies felt that they were not substantially engaged during development of the federal certification procedures regulations that now heavily rely on state licensure requirements. And that matters because state licensing boards are obviously ultimately the entities responsible for defining and enforcing the professional licensure standards within their jurisdiction. So this creates a bit of an alignment challenge where, as Sarah's mentioned earlier, the federal, or Kris, the federal regulations may assume a level of consistency and availability of information, whereas the reality is that licensing processes vary significantly across states, professions, and boards. But the responses highlight an opportunity for stronger and more intentional collaboration between federal policymakers and state licensing authorities. While institutions are experiencing significant workload increases, it's also important to recognize that licensing boards face their own set of constraints. Boards are managing their own responsibilities, licensing renewals, continuing education, complaints, disciplinary actions, background review processes, alongside increasing numbers of institutional inquiries related to educational programs and licensure standards. But at the same time, many boards operate with limited staffing and in some cases, limited subject matter expertise available for more detailed curriculum level review. Some boards rely on external consultants when evaluating complex programs, particularly in highly regulated fields. In addition, legal constraints play a significant role. Boards may face liability concerns or statutory limitations that restrict their ability to provide binding determinations or definitive statements about program eligibility. And that's important context for institutions because it helps explain why institutions might sometimes receive that generalized guidance or referrals back to statutes or regulations or other responses that stop short of formal confirmation. In our live polling at Clear, we asked participants to identify the most significant barriers that the boards face when responding to institutional inquiries. Their responses reflected those pretty clearly, where we had 82% cited liability concerns or legal limits on providing binding answers, 47% pointed to the complexity of program by program review, and 41% noted limited staff capacity. We also asked licensing agencies to reflect on how well institutions understand licensure requirements. Half of the respondents, 50%, indicated that institutional understanding varies significantly from one institution to another. Another portion indicated only partial understanding across institutions, and notably, none of the respondents selected that institutions understand requirements very well. What we think this suggests is not necessarily a lack of effort on the institutional side, but rather just illustrative of the wide variability in interpretation, capacity, and access to reliable information. Importantly, licensing boards identified several opportunities that could improve coordination and responsiveness across licensure systems. When asked what could help boards better support institutions, the most frequently identified need was stronger coordination between federal and state regulators. But boards also emphasized the value of better understanding of institutional practices, shared tools and templates, and increased staffing capacity. Some respondents even highlighted the importance of collaboration across the boards themselves. Perhaps one of the most encouraging findings from this part of the research is the level of openness to collaboration. When we asked the licensing board participants about their willingness to engage more directly with higher education stakeholders, 67% indicated they're interested in collaborating with higher education associations, and the rest indicated that they might be. It just depends on the structure or the topic. And while there might not be simple solutions, these findings suggest that there's real opportunity for more cross-sector dialogue, more shared problem solving, and more intentional alignment between policy expectations and operational realities. And that becomes especially important as institutions continue building sustainable compliance structures moving forward. So at this point, we want to shift from describing the operational challenges institutions are experiencing to discussing why this work requires institution-wide coordination. One of the clearest themes from the research is that licensure compliance is not just a technical compliance function. It's deeply connected to institutional strategy, enrollment management, risk management, student support, and many other responsibilities institutions have. For many institutions, these obligations require leadership level conversations about resources, institutional priorities, operational sustainability, and how to balance student protection and student access. So what Sarah will do next is outline some ways that we think institutions could use this data to act on the information internally with institutional stakeholders in ways that can support the needs of those doing this work.
Thanks, Kathryn. So just briefly, how can you use this data? Data is particularly powerful when we are engaging the institutional leadership. Survey findings can help demonstrate that the challenges we've discussed, again, are not isolated to one institution or one profession or one region. You can use this data to support requests for staffing or technology resources, explain why coordination across units is critical, justify prioritization decisions, and connect compliance work to broader institutional goals and mission. Next slide. Another consistent finding from the research is that professional licensure compliance cannot realistically be managed by a single office operating alone. It's important that leadership understands this. Effective compliance often requires coordination across all of these different areas: compliance offices, legal counsel, admission, registrar, IT, academic affairs, online learning units, and academic programs themselves, of course. Institutions described the importance of clearly defining roles and responsibilities so that critical processes such as disclosures, student location tracking, enrollment restrictions, curriculum review do not fall through the organizational gaps. Thus, the survey data can help institutions frame licensure compliance as a shared institutional responsibility rather than solely a compliance office responsibility. And last, it's critical, of course, that we work particularly close with and support our academic program leadership by sharing data that informs their decision-making. For example, many programs traditionally focus on home state requirements, but today's environment requires a multi-state perspective. Survey findings reveal that approximately 32% of the institutions restrict programs or states due to licensure uncertainty. This underscores how regulatory variability directly affects program reach and student access. Thus, using state variation data can help academic leadership better understand why compliance concerns sometimes require operational or curricular adjustments. So now we'll hear from Kris, who will wrap this up with implementation and process considerations. Kris?
Great, thanks, Sarah. So just a few things to keep in mind as you all are continuing to refine your approach to this work at your institution. And I think, Sarah just mentioned several of these challenges that come along with one person being responsible for this work or having a very disjointed effort or team to manage it, right? There can quickly be gaps, institutional knowledge lost, and those kind of things. So here's some keys to keep in mind when you are building out a sustainable, robust process that can support these compliance efforts. So, regulations and requirements are going to change. So it is important to have a more formalized process and system in place at your institution to tackle this workload, not to just place it on one person's shoulders to have them go figure it out. It's important to really have a thoughtful approach to this and build out something that can survive if things change, or I should say when they change, right? With most of this compliance work, it is going to change. It's just a matter of when, not if. So this will take an investment in potentially additional staff or people power, training and education for those that are going to be touching this work. And again, really building out a thoughtful, sustainable process of everything from creating those initial public disclosures, keeping them updated on a regular basis, those individual direct disclosures. Sarah mentioned not very many of us have automated those. And even if it is automated, we still need to have some manual interventions. So really diving in and building out something that's going to work for your institution is going to require an investment, most likely, in time and people. I think also Sarah and Kathryn both touched on this as well, but really this comes back to protecting students. The whole premise of these federal Title IV regulations and the SARA Policy 5.2 is really to help make sure that students are going to be able to be licensed and employed in the profession or occupation that you're preparing them for. So it's important to be communicating clearly with your prospective students. And that's where things like those individual direct disclosures are so important, that there is a process in place and that it is something that's being tracked, and you're ensuring that it's being documented so that if there was ever an audit, you could satisfy those requirements as well. So documentation, again, just touched on that. It's important across the board here, but in particular for a couple of things, those direct disclosures and the written attestation exception. If your institution is one that is utilizing that written attestation, which as Sarah mentioned, many of us are, then it's important that that is also being clearly documented and retained so that it could be made available in the future if needed. And collaboration is so important. I'm going to do a plug for SAN here in a moment, but there are great organizations like the State Authorization Network that have formal mechanisms for you to collaborate with your peers across different institutions. And if you're not part of SAN, we'll encourage you to join that in a few moments, but also just collaborating within your state, right? So many of you are already participating in state meetings on a regular basis, whether your SARA state portal entity brings you together, or there's other kind of collaborative networks already developed across your state. Make sure that licensure is a topic that you all are occasionally talking about. How are you covering this work? What kind of systems and processes have you implemented to really make this something that is more formal and, again, will be more sustainable for the institution in the long run? Next slide, please. We have a couple other things to consider. I already plugged SAN. I'm going to keep doing it. I'll tell you, HELP is a SAN member, and I have benefited tremendously from being a part of HELP, a part of SAN over the years, even before higher education licensure pros existed, when I was working at an institution. So SAN has a lot of great resources. Here is one that will help you build out a more formalized compliance plan related to professional licensure. So here are some things to keep in mind on this slide as you're doing that. And again, as I mentioned, right, building out something that's more formalized, that's not dependent on one person to shoulder all of this, and kind of ad hoc approaches as things come up. Having this system in place is going to make a difference. And next slide, I've got one more thing to consider for you, that it should be a team effort. So even for those of you where you have one staff person maybe responsible for this right now, there's definitely information that's needed from other parts of the institution. So this kind of informal team approach is already happening, but I do think there's a benefit to have something more formalized in place. And so maybe it's building a specific committee that's focused on professional licensure compliance and professional licensure issues across the institution. Maybe it's something within individual colleges or programs where there's a clear designation of who's going to be responsible for what, and that group comes together on a regular basis. So on this slide, you'll see some important key players at most institutions that will need to be involved in some fashion in licensure compliance work. Sometimes people don't realize that extent of the curriculum comparison that could be needed. I touched on this very briefly, but you are going to need, in a lot of instances, somebody who's very intimately familiar with the curriculum down to assignments, even that type of thing. So making sure there's a process to have your subject matter experts, whether that's faculty or whomever, that's available to do those curriculum comparisons is really critical. Your enrollment team or admissions, obviously, also very important, especially when we get to things like those direct disclosures, the written attestations, ensuring that your institution is not enrolling students that are located in a state or territory where your program doesn't meet unless you've satisfied that written attestation exception process. And finally, you might need some external support. So this is a tremendous amount of work. Institutions often don't have all of the right capacity just internally to do it. And so that's why we created Higher Education Licensure Pros, is to be a partner to institutions that could use some support in professional licensure compliance. So I'll just do a brief plug for Higher Education Licensure Pros. you want to go to the next slide, Kathryn, we do have something called a bookmark. It's a one-of-a-kind research platform where we have compiled those educational requirements for licensure across all 59 US states and territories. We're at close to 90 license types available now. We're continuing to add to that over time. And we do have a team that keeps this regularly updated. So we monitor legislation, we monitor proposed regulation changes as they're coming down from states, and then keep the bookmark updated accordingly once things are changed and let users know about that. At HELP, we also consult with things like developing a robust compliance process for professional licensure, everything from making sure you have a written attestation process in place if that's something that your institution wants to do, making sure your public disclosures are satisfying the Title IV requirements, as well as the SARA Policy 5.2 and other custom training and research projects. And then finally, before we shift to questions, I already kind of plugged the State Authorization Network, but I definitely want to do it again because SAN is such a great resource, especially when we talk about collaborating with others who are doing this work or trying to do this work at institutions. So if you don't know about State Authorization Network, please check them out. And again, membership is definitely beneficial as there are many resources that are limited to just SAN members so that you can find them on their website, different white papers, different guides that have been developed, and not just about professional licensure, but really any issue that is going to touch an institution's ability to be enrolling students or operating in other states. So really great, tremendous resource. And I think now it's time for questions. So Jonathan, I think, is going to come back in to ask us those and help moderate.
Yes, thank you, Kris, Sarah, and Kathryn. We have a small section of questions that we'll go through, and then I'm sure we'll have a few more come through as we ask these ones. The first one, and I think this one was in response to one of the things we had shared in the responsibility slide, and it is with the multi-state compacts, how will this affect the compliance of licensure requirements? I'm unsure if this was for the regional compacts or maybe state-to-state licensure compacts.
I can take a stab at answering it, and then Kathryn and Sarah, please jump in. So I would say first, in case this wasn't clear, the state authorization reciprocity agreement has really nothing to do with professional licensing requirements, except that there's SARA Policy 5.2 that requires institutions follow all applicable federal requirements when it comes to your professional licensure programs. So I'm hoping that that makes sense, but essentially your ability to operate in other states that you may have by participation in SARA really isn't relevant when it comes to any of these licensure issues, including maybe the ability or the need to have approval by a state licensing board, for example, nursing, in order to enroll your students from out of state. And then compacts more broadly, like licensure compacts or licensure reciprocity agreements, those sometimes can be a factor when you start digging into the details for a particular profession or occupation. And again, that comparison of does your program meet the educational requirements for licensure in other states? I will say that the US Department of Education addressed this in their question and answer that they released a couple of years ago. I can drop the link in the chat here in a moment for folks to take a look at yourselves, but it's a bit conflicting what they've provided in the Q&A. And so I think my recommendation to folks is proceed with very high caution if you're planning to utilize the existence of a compact or your state's participation in a compact in order to come to that meets conclusion. I think mostly we're looking at things outside of a compact. So how does someone who graduates from a program meet the educational standards for licensure in a state? And often a compact is not part of that equation. Kathryn or Sarah, anything else you two want to share? I'll find that link and drop it in the chat here.
I guess the only part I would add is just with these compacts, they apply to the practitioner who's already licensed. So as Kris was saying, to proceed with caution, there are other steps you would want to kind of undertake to really do that analysis to be able to confirm that that would be a pathway for a student to be able to use, because they would almost likely in all the compacts I'm aware of, have to obtain the license first. So you'd really want to take the steps to mapping out what that would look like for each student and state to be able to confidently make that determination.
Thank you both. The next question that we have here is, uh, could you all talk a little bit more about the difference between a licensure program and a regulated profession that doesn't have a license associated with it, and how institutions may approach these differently?
I'm happy to take that one again. Sarah and Kathryn. Okay. Yeah. So I don't think I said this in my responsibilities overview. So I'll say it now because I think it's worth saying. But first off, licensure is an umbrella term that's used really to cover many different things. So we could be talking about something called a certification, registration, endorsement. Again, because each state gets to set their own standards with this, the terminology is very inconsistent from state to state. So with that in mind, there are going to be things that maybe seem like it could fit under these requirements, but the key is it's something that's issued and required for employment in a state by a state. So it has to be something issued by a state entity, such as a licensing board or agency or a state Department of Education, something by that state entity, and it's required for employment in that particular profession or occupation. So if it doesn't meet that two-part test, then it most likely is not going to be covered under these responsibilities. So things like a private issued certification, like if you want to be certified in IT as a particular thing, those are not fit under these responsibilities because that's not a state issued credential that's required for employment in the field. So I think I addressed that one.
And Kris, I would add that thinking about the IT, for example, an employer might require it. Like they might, and that could be true with things like dietitians and things like that, that in some states regulate them and some states don't regulate them, but their employer may require it. And that's completely different. And correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that can be confusing sometimes.
No, that's a great point, Sarah. Absolutely. Employer required versus, state required under state law, two different things.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add in this circumstance, whether a program is maybe not a licensure program and wouldn't fall within all the certification procedures, kind of requirements that we've been talking about. I would still recommend just considering just very general like consumer and misrepresentation information. So are there information that a person completing this program or course, in a regulated profession would need to know, and just making sure to review that information is accurate. That would be an additional thing too. And that would be the case for licensure programs or, any programs, but just kind of assuring that alignment in communications.
Great point. And I'll just add one more thing because I don't think we've touched on this yet either. Under SARA policy 5.2, so if your institution is participating in SARA, the State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement, just note that this would cover things beyond your Title IV programs. So if you have something that is designed to result in a new license, again, that state issued credential, whatever it's called, that's required for employment, it could also be covered. So this could extend to your non-credit offerings, really beyond Title IV. So I just wanted to throw that in because I know I didn't mention that earlier.
All right, this next one's kind of in line with some of what we said before. We talked about state licensure requirements. We talked about employer licensure requirements. But the next question is, would programs that have a national certification offered, such as the Federal Aviation Administration certifications, would those also be required inside of our disclosures?
So I would say my perspective on that is it because it's not state issued. And if you look to the Title IV regulations in particular, there is a definition of state, capital S state, and it's specific to just the US states and delineated territories. But I want to point back to what Kathryn just said is, it's really still important to be disclosing accurate information about the outcomes for those types of programs in your advertising and to your students, so that while it might not fit under these exact responsibilities around, certification or certifying and disclosure, that it's still really important that it is accurate if you are preparing students for that they understand what they're being prepared for.
Thank
And
you.
I just want to get clarification from the two of you, if we have time, Jonathan. So there's the national certification, but you would still have to see, it's possible that a state could, yes, require that national certification, but they may have other requirements as well, right? So just by getting that national certification, you are not automatically, you can't just assume that that means that they're good in every state. Is that accurate? I mean, I think
Yes.
accounting is one of those that if your program is designed specifically to lead to an accounting license, and that's been an interesting one because it's regulated so oddly, but there's a national exam. But my understanding is that that alone doesn't mean that you're meeting the requirements for every state, even though some of them that might be the only requirement that they have, but some states may have more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Sarah. Oftentimes I do hear that from folks like, well, our graduates or our students or graduates can sit for that night, licensing exam, whatever the national exam is. That is not enough because there could be states or a state somewhere that's thrown in their own kind of requirements. So it's still really critical to do that state by state research and understand what their educational requirements are. I will say for many license types, there's going to be one exam that pretty much all states have adopted as the examination requirement, but that's the examination requirement, which is distinct from the educational requirements. In some cases, there's not going to be much beyond maybe holding, a certain level of degree or something plus the exam. But in other instances, there are going to be very specific course requirements or credit requirements or those clinical hours or something that is going to need comparison to an institution's program.
Yeah.
All right, thank you all. The next one we have is, what should an institution do when a licensing board does not oversee or approve programs?
I suspect that this question is related to an instance where a license doesn't exist in a particular state. If that's not the right way to interpret that question, whoever asked it, feel free to clarify. But and if that is the case, then I would point back again to that question and answers that the U.S. Department of Education issued. Mary had dropped the link in the chat for folks earlier. So basically, Department of Ed has said you can disclose something along the lines of, a license is not required or does not exist in that particular state or territory, and that would satisfy the disclosure requirements. Oddly enough, in an earlier version of the Q&A, they said you could disclose that it meets the educational requirements as long as you put kind of some context around that it meets because there's no license that exists or, it's not regulated in that state. But they revised that answer over time. So if you look at the website now at the Q&As, it says, basically you should disclose that nothing exists or nothing's required for that state or territory.
I've run into that with behavior analysis. That's one that it's just starting now to be regulated, but there are many states that don't. And so, yeah, we're trying to be clear about that.
Mm-hmm.
One distinction I would make, or just extra point added on to that in terms of approval. So I know when we're talking about certification procedures, we've been mentioning that a lot of boards, if not most, will not directly give institutions, that direct confirmation about educational requirements. But then there's state requirements for program approval that might also apply in certain cases, and that's a distinct analysis. So just in case the question was referring to that, you would also want to analyze whether the board has requirements for an out-of-state institution to have the program approved before they enroll students there, or the clinicals enrolled there. Kris mentioned it, but I just wanted to point that out there that they are two different kind of hurdles to overcome in order to offer a program in another state.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next one, maybe any of y'all could provide some help on, is there a sample template or form for the written attestation situations?
I want Kathryn to answer that because I feel like I get an answer from SAN that, is the right answer.
Well, that's a lot of pressure. The simple answer is that the Department of Education did not give any sample template language. The main things that institutions will want to make sure to include is the name of the student, the name of the state where they're currently located, like the where the institution has determined the student's located at the time of initial enrollment, and then the student's declaration of a single state where they're saying that they intend to seek employment after graduation. Just process considerations, it's important to make sure that that's completely on the student of making that selection in terms of the state they intend to do that. But other explanation that institutions, might want to add as part of the attestation, maybe to give some context on why they're, asking the student for this and what it means for them. Institutions are able to come up with that themselves, but those essential elements of the student's name, current location, and intended location for employment should be included. And Kris, please feel free to add anything else.
No, I think you covered it well, Kathryn. Unfortunately, there's not a template that's been provided, so it is up to each institution. I'll also pass on to Mary to put in the chat. We have at Help created, or I should say gathered, some samples of written attestations that folks have been willing to share. And so I'll just share them with this big caveat. This is not a template. This is not meant to be, an example that you would take and just wholesale adopt at your institution, but it does have some of that additional language or context that Kathryn mentioned, things that you might want to consider also including in your written attestation as well. So I will get that to Mary to get in the chat.
And I think one reason that I did want to defer to you in the original after the original question was because I know that SAN, you all do not provide that template either, right? And I, understand why. I think in practice, what happens is that institutions will do maybe what you're doing, Kris, which is, what are you using? Can you send me a sample? If I remember correctly, SAN has a kind of a listserv chat sort of thing. And I think people have asked for samples through that as well. So that's probably, in addition to looking at Kris's samples, I think that's probably a good way to do it. But always have your own legal counsel review it before you put it out.
Absolutely.
All right, I have two questions here that I'm going to merge into one so you can answer them at the same time. So they're kind of related. The first one being, can you describe what policies and processes some institutions have implemented for student location tracking? We've considered requiring one annual checkup with our students to confirm the location via electronic forms and certain response triggers for certain disclosures. And then the next one being, in sending communications within 14 days of change of address, what is the best practice for compliance?
Man, I feel like we could. Oh, go ahead, Kathryn.
I'm just gonna start with just like a couple of like points in time that we've seen institutions kind of collect the data. There certainly are, good practice considerations to keep in mind. Obviously, at the time that the student applies for the program, collecting that information, that's almost essential at this point in order to make sure that you can enroll the student into the program. But at other points in time where institutions are able, we see institutions collecting that at the time of registration in each term. Some institutional the registration systems are able to collect that at the time a student is selecting the classes, and so institutions have developed different ways of asking students that before they enroll. That way they have that information and can provide the disclosures as well. and I'll let Kris share more, but just in terms of you have the points in time that you want to make sure that you have student location, and just deciding on a reasonable process and frequency to being able to update that information and then updating your state determinations. You just want to make sure that you are capturing it in a reasonable amount of time to be able to give students any updated information that they might need throughout their, their career at the institution.
Yeah, I was gonna say I feel like we could have a whole webinar just on those two questions, Jonathan, to be fair, but they're great questions. And Kathryn's right. I think the key is, you need to have a reasonable, defensible process that works for your institution. Just knowing those parameters, right? That you need to, in order to enroll, make sure the student's located somewhere where the program meets the educational requirements, or if they're not, that you're going to put them through the written attestation process to enroll them. So that point in time is really important to know where their location is. And then as far as the 14-day piece, it's really, think about it, 14 days from when the institution becomes aware of that change of the situation. So if the student is providing you with their updated address, which is being used as the location per your student location policy, you would have 14 calendar days from when that information is provided by that student to make the change. Or if you learn about a change to a state's requirements, you would have 14 calendar days from when that change was known and understood that it's impacting that program. So it's a does not meet scenario. So I think the 14 calendar days can be scary for people, and I understand why, especially if you don't have automated processes around this, if it's really a manual report that's being run. With that in mind, right, you probably want to have that report be running weekly if it is a manual report, so that you would have some time to get the correct information out to the right student based on their updated address.
One thing I'd add just quickly, I think the importance of documentation here is really important. So in addition to whatever documenting whatever frequency the institution decides, especially when that 14 days might be triggered because of a change in state requirements. If you documented in your process that you've decided to check requirements on an annual basis, and that might be, a reasonable frequency based on the institutional capacity, just making sure that's documented and that you've documented the last date of review. That way you can say that you have checked it within that time frame. Because you don't want to necessarily leave it up to a court or another body to decide whether 2 years between checks was a reasonable time. But if you're following your institutional processes and you can stick to that, that would certainly help the institution in terms of their risk management.
All right, we are very short on time, but I have exactly one question left, so I'm going to read it. And Kris, I'm going to give you like 30 seconds max to answer it. And that last one is, how do we handle CPA licensure in states that offer an additional pathway beyond the traditional pathway? And there's an example in there as well, if you're able to. If not, it's okay.
Yeah. So again, we've done a whole webinar on this at Help within the last few months, because there are big shifts happening for certified public accountant licensing. And so I will just say, what I'm hearing from institutions is it now could make a lot of sense for your bachelor's program in accounting to be a licensure program. It may not have made sense before because there was a 150 semester credit hour cap, but the new pathways are eliminating that. So take a fresh look at your accounting offerings. They may now be licensure programs, even if they weren't last year. Things are actively changing in a lot of states right now.
Yes. Thank you, Kris. And thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate all of you coming here and sharing your expertise and your questions. Reminder, please complete our survey. The survey will be available as you exit the webinar, and the link is in the chat. We've already posted the presentation to our website, and we'll post the recording of today's event soon. We have answered all the questions, so those are all covered there. And we hope you'll keep informed with MHEC by subscribing to us on our website for future opportunities. Thank you to all of our panelists for coming and sharing your knowledge, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.